Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something fascinating. The idea that modern secularism, the separation of church and state, might not be this purely Western invention we often assume it is.
That's right. We're looking at sources that trace some of the core concepts back, maybe surprisingly, to medieval Islamic philosophers.
Specifically, we're focusing on Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he was known in the West, a 12th century thinker.
Exactly. And his whole project was largely about trying to reconcile philosophy, basically reason, with religious revelation, trying to make them coexist.
And the sources suggest his work, especially how he tried to protect philosophy from religion, ironically laid some groundwork for later European ideas about separating the state from religion.
It's a really interesting journey. He was trying to carve out space for reason within a religious framework, but that idea got transformed quite a bit when it traveled west.
Okay, so let's unpack that. How does someone arguing for harmony end up influencing the idea of, separation? Let's start with Ibn Rushd himself. All right, so Ibn Rushd, he lived from 1126 to 1198, and he wasn't starting from scratch, was he? He was building on earlier thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina.
Correct. They had already put forth this idea that philosophy, pure reason, and religious revelation were, let's say, parallel paths, both leading to fundamental truth.
So two ways to get to the same endpoint, essentially.
Pretty much. But Ibn Rushd was championing this in a pretty hostile environment. He was pushing back hard against figures like Al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali, the famous theologian who wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, arguing philosophy was, dangerous and incompatible with faith.
That's the one. Al-Ghazali's critique was powerful. And so Ibn Rushd's response wasn't just, a defense. It was almost a rescue mission for philosophy, particularly Aristotelian logic.
And how did he do that? Just write complex counter-arguments?
Well, yes, but he did something else too, which the sources highlight. He worked to make these complex Greek philosophical ideas, especially logic and metaphysics, more accessible, sort of democratizing them.
Why? To win popular support against the theologians.
Partly, yeah. To shield philosophy from what the source calls the hostility of both camps, the rigid philosophers and the suspicious theologians. By making it understandable, he hoped to show it wasn't some secret, dangerous art.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's another layer here, isn't there? The sources mention he was actually quite strategic about who got the full picture.
Yes, absolutely. This is fascinating. When writing for a broader audience, what he apparently called the less erudite masses, he would consciously simplify things.
Simplify how? Like dumbing it down?
Maybe more like filtering. He might hide some of the really complex jargon or even omit certain lines of argument if he felt they could be easily misunderstood or, worse, misused. It was a form of intellectual protectionism almost.
Protecting philosophy by controlling its interpretation.
Wow. And this strategy influenced how he approached religious law, the Sharia. Because he saw Sharia as a kind of revelation already supported by reason, he argued it didn't need the complex metaphorical interpretations that theologians often applied.
So he's saying the law itself is rational, accessible through reason, not just blind faith or complex metaphor.
In essence, yes.
Right.
Which, broadens the scope for philosophical thinking quite a bit. Now, here's the kicker for its later influence. When his works reached Europe, they often arrived, as the source puts it, in a corrupted form.
Corrupted, okay. What does that mean? Bad translations or deliberate changes?
Probably a bit of both, but mostly think translation difficulties and decontextualization. Yeah. Translating dense philosophical Arabic, often through Hebrew into Latin, was incredibly challenging.
So nuances got lost.
Big time. Arguments got simplified, pulled out of their original context. Europeans often received the conclusion like the idea of separate domains for reason and faith, without the full picture of why Ibn Rushd argued for it, which was about harmony, not conflict.
So the necessary subtlety, the goal of coexistence, kind of fell away in translation.
Exactly, which made the idea seem much more radical, maybe more starkly oppositional than he perhaps intended. And this core idea that reason and revelation are two distinct paths to the same ultimate truth, that brings us to what the source calls perennialism. This concept, which Ibn Rushd really ran with, came largely from Al-Farabi before him.
Al-Farabi, right. And this is presented as a kind of true pluralism. How so?
Well, perennialism here means that philosophy and religion are fundamentally aiming at the same reality, the same truth. They just use different methods, different languages.
Okay, so how did Al-Farabi explain the obvious differences between religions then, if the truth is one?
His explanation was really insightful. He suggested that religions differ because the underlying spiritual and intellectual truths get presented through what he called imaginative representations.
Imaginative representations like metaphors, symbols, stories tailored to specific cultures.
Exactly. Tailored for the understanding of the masses in different times and places. But the core philosophical account of reality, the deep truth behind those representations, Al-Farabi argued, is one and the same everywhere.
A universal truth dressed in local clothes, so to speak.
A good way to put it. But critically, even if the truth is one, the methods for grasping it are not equal in philosophical terms. And this is where Al-Farabi and later Ibn Rushd made a key distinction in how we know things.
Ah, okay. The classification of knowledge.
Right. They distinguished between two main types. The highest form was certain demonstration, al-burhan ayakini. Think of this as rigorous logical proof, like mathematics or formal logic.
Based on intellectual intuition combined with undeniable logical steps, istinbat.
Precisely. It leads to certainty. It's the gold standard for philosophers.
Okay, so what's the other type? The one associated more with religious law, the millah.
That they called persuasion alikna. This type of knowledge relies more on rhetoric, on convincing arguments, on appeals to emotion or tradition, rather than strict logical demonstration.
So it's not necessarily false, but the way you arrive at it or convince others of it is different. It's persuasive rather than demonstrably certain.
Exactly. Think of the difference between proving a geometric theorem versus giving a compelling sermon or a political speech. Both aim for acceptance, but one relies on logical necessity, the other on effective persuasion.
Oh.
This created a clear hierarchy of knowledge.
Demonstration at the top, persuasion below it. Okay, I can see how that distinction could be. Oh, powerful. Right, so we have this framework, dual truths, imaginative representations, and this hierarchy of knowledge demonstration over persuasion, all developed by thinkers like Ibn Rushd, largely to defend philosophy within an Islamic context.
Yeah, to carve out its legitimate space.
Now let's make that pivot. How does this complex intellectual toolkit get picked up and, well, repurposed in Europe? This is where the irony really kicks in, isn't it?
It really is quite ironic, because remember, Ibn Rushd's primary goal in separating these spheres of philosophy and theology was to shield philosophy from potential attacks or censorship by religious authorities.
To protect reason from faith, in a sense, or at least from its institutional power.
Right. But when fragments of this idea, especially the hierarchy part, arrived in Europe, the political context was completely different. The dominant power was the church.
So the perceived threat was reversed.
Exactly. In the West, the problem wasn't protecting philosophy from the mosque. It was emerging states trying to assert their independence from the overwhelming political and social influence of the church.
Ah, so they took Ibn Rushd's idea of separation, but flipped its application. Instead of protecting philosophy from religion, it became about protecting the state from the church.
Precisely. European rulers and later political thinkers saw in Averroism a justification for limiting the church's temporal power. The state needed its own sphere, based on reason and law, free from ecclesiastical control. The idea of separation became a political tool.
But it seems like Europe went much further than just separation. Ibn Rushd, following Al-Farabi, was talking about pluralism, coexistence, two paths to truth. Yet, as the source mentions, we end up with forms of secularism, like French laïcité or in Turkey, that are almost militant.
Yes, that's a key point.
They don't just separate, they actively push religion out of the public sphere, a total negation almost. Why did that happen? Why didn't the original pluralistic ideas survive?
Well, I think it goes back to the different goals. Ibn Rushd wanted intellectual harmony and freedom for philosophers. The European actors who adopted these ideas often wanted political liberation from the church's dominance.
So they focus on the hierarchy aspect. That reason demonstration is superior to faith-based arguments, persuasion.
Exactly. They seized on that hierarchy. If reason is the superior path to demonstrable truth, then maybe the sphere governed by reason, the state, the law, public life, should have primacy over the sphere governed by revelation or persuasion.
And that gets weaponized politically.
You could say that. It became the justification not just for separation, but for the subordination of the religious sphere in public matters, sometimes leading to its outright exclusion. That's a radical step far beyond Ibn Rushd's original intent of philosophical coexistence.
And this impact was so significant that Ibn Rushd's philosophy actually got its own name in Europe, Averroism.
That's right. It became a distinct intellectual current.
So if you had to boil Averroism down, what was its defining feature, the thing that really resonated and drove its influence, especially leading into the Enlightenment?
Fundamentally, it was the primacy of reason over revelation. That core takeaway, however simplified or decontextualized from Ibn Rushd's full thought, was incredibly powerful.
Giving reason the top spot, especially in understanding the world and organizing society.
Precisely. And this wasn't just abstract talk among scholars. It had real-world political application. The source gives a great example. Frederick II.
The Holy Roman Emperor, back
Yeah.
in the 13th century.
Yep, died in 1250. He was famously, almost constantly, in conflict with the papacy over power and authority.
Always fighting over who was really in charge, the emperor or the pope.
Exactly. And Frederick actively sought out and used translated works of Ibn Rushd. Why? Because Averroism provided a philosophical basis for arguing that secular rational authority, his authority, was independent of and maybe even superior to religious authority.
So it gave him intellectual ammunition in his power struggles with the church.
Absolutely. It helped justify a ruler governing based on reason and law, not just divine right mediated by the church.
And this use of aphorism, this idea of reason's primacy, then fed into the later Enlightenment thinker.
Yes, it became one of the streams feeding into Enlightenment thought. It provided a framework for thinking about society, law, and knowledge that stood apart from, and sometimes in direct contrast to, the dominant Christian theological tradition. It opened up space for secular political thought. Hashtag outro.
So if we wrap this up, what we've seen in this deep dive is really a fascinating intellectual journey. We started with Al-Farabi's idea of pluralism, refined and defended by Ibn Rushd in the Islamic world. An attempt to harmonize faith and reason, creating separate but valid domains for both.
Right, but then we saw how that nuanced philosophical project, when transmitted to Europe, lost some context and was transformed.
Yeah.
The emphasis shifted from harmony to hierarchy.
And that hierarchy, the primacy of reason, became a key tool in the European struggle to separate political power from religious control, ultimately paving the way for modern secularism.
It laid some crucial groundwork, yeah.
So the big takeaway here seems to be that the impulse towards secular thinking, towards prioritizing reason in public life, has these really deep, complex, and perhaps unexpected roots winding back through Islamic philosophy centuries before the European Enlightenment.
It certainly complicates the simple narrative of secularism being purely a Western post-Christian phenomenon. The desire for intellectual freedom, for a space governed by reason, has a much longer and more diverse history.
And the key twist is how an idea initially aimed at coexistence between different kinds of truth got politically reshaped into an idea often used for negation or separation in the public square.
That transformation is central.
Okay, so here's something to leave you, our listeners, thinking about. If the original philosophical move towards prioritizing reason, as we saw with Averroes, wasn't necessarily about rejecting religious truth, but about harmonizing different kinds of truth demonstration versus persuasion, what might that forgotten history tell us about our own contemporary debates? You know, the often zero-sum arguments we have today about the place of faith, reason, knowledge, and authority in public life. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?